The Red Book, the madness that made Carl Jung divine. What if the madness you fear is not your destruction but your initiation? What if losing your mind is the soul's way of finding God? In a world terrified of the irrational, Carl Jung dared to descend into his own darkness, and there he discovered the divine. The Red Book is not a diary of insanity. It is the sacred record of a man who walked through madness and found God waiting on the other side. Part 1. The descent into the unconscious when reason collapses. When Carl Jung began his journey into what would later be called the Red Book, he was not seeking madness, yet it found him. Around 1913, Jung entered what he described as a confrontation with the unconscious, a period that defied logic, scientific discipline, and the boundaries of rational thought. For a man who had built his career on psychiatry and empirical study, what followed was a radical descent, a deliberate step into the chaos of his own psyche. But this was not an accident, it was an initiation. Jung realized that the modern mind, obsessed with reason, had amputated itself from the irrational and the sacred. What began as visions and voices during a time of personal crisis evolved into a creative and spiritual experiment. Jung allowed the floodgates of the unconscious to open. He listened to the voices within not as pathology, but as messages from the deeper strata of the soul. His contemporaries might have labeled it psychosis. Jung, however, understood it as divine madness, the necessary destruction of the ego for the rebirth of the self. He described seeing rivers of blood, ancient gods returning, and images of mythic destruction. For him, this was not delusion. It was the soul demanding attention. The unconscious was no longer a theoretical concept, it was alive, breathing, and speaking. This experience marked the beginning of his departure from Sigmund Freud's world of repressed instincts toward his own realm of symbols, myth, and meaning. In the Red Book, Jung confronts the paradox of divine madness. In Greek philosophy, this concept meant a kind of inspired insanity when the divine enters a human and reason temporarily dissolves. Plato wrote about the mania that accompanies artistic inspiration or prophetic vision. Jung experienced this firsthand. He was not merely observing the psyche, he was being transformed by it. He stood on the edge between genius and psychosis and chose to walk through it consciously. He did not reject his madness. He dialogued with it. This was the revolutionary act to treat inner chaos as sacred material, not as something to be suppressed. He understood that healing does not come by avoiding darkness, but by entering it with awareness. Jung wrote that the descent into the unconscious always leads to the transformation of personality. This descent is the archetypal night sea journey, a mythic motif found in countless traditions, where the hero must enter the underworld to reclaim the lost parts of his soul. Jung's descent mirrored that of mythic figures like Orpheus, Christ, or Dante. Each faces the abyss, not for destruction, but for revelation. What distinguishes Jung is that he turned this inward odyssey into a psychological method. He called it active imagination, a process where one interacts with the images of the unconscious as if they were real beings. This was not a creative fantasy, it was a spiritual discipline. Through this dialogue, Jung bridged the conscious and unconscious mind, establishing communication between the ego and the soul. In these dialogues, Jung discovered that the unconscious is not simply a repository of repressed content, it is a living dimension of psychic life with its own intelligence and purpose. The figures he encountered spoke in riddles, symbols, and paradoxes. They confronted him with moral challenges, spiritual insights, and the terrifying realization that the human soul contains both heaven and hell. Jung wrote, "I found myself confronted with all the things that I had never allowed myself to consider." The unconscious forced him to witness the totality of his being, his darkness, arrogance, lust, fear, and divine potential. This is why Jung's madness was sacred. It was not a breakdown, but a breakthrough, a necessary dismantling of the rigid ego that had governed him as a scientist and public figure. The ego resists the unconscious because it threatens its control. But Jung learned that only by surrendering to the irrational could one achieve wholeness. His journey revealed a universal law: the soul compensates for the one-sidedness of consciousness. When we ignore the irrational, it returns as visions, symptoms, or crises that demand to be integrated. In his private journals, Jung described nights filled with dread when he felt he might truly lose his mind. Yet he continued to write, to draw, to converse with inner figures. He realized that the psyche seeks balance between order and chaos. The more he accepted his visions, the less power they held over him. He was discovering that the act of conscious observation itself transforms madness into meaning. The first lesson of the Red Book is that descent is not failure, it is initiation. Jung's confrontation with his unconscious symbolizes a pattern that exists in every human life. At some point, each person faces a crisis where the old identity no longer fits, where reason fails to explain suffering. This is the moment when the psyche calls us inward. We may feel madness approaching, emotional breakdowns, existential despair, depression. Yet beneath that chaos lies the soul's demand for transformation. In Jungian terms, the ego must die so that the self can emerge. The ego's collapse feels like insanity, because it is losing its dominance. The rational mind cannot comprehend what the soul is doing. But what feels like madness is often the psyche's creative reorganization, destroying what is false to reveal what is true. Jung's divine madness therefore mirrors the archetype of death and rebirth. Throughout his visions, Jung wrestled with opposing forces, light and dark, order and chaos, divine and demonic. He understood that these were not moral categories but psychic realities that must coexist. He discovered that the divine is not found in purity, but in the union of opposites. The soul is both angel and beast, both creator and destroyer. His willingness to embrace contradiction is what allowed him to integrate the total psyche. Jung's madness was not the madness of loss, but of gain, the gain of soul. What terrified him was also what liberated him. He learned that the unconscious is not an enemy. It is the forgotten half of ourselves. When we meet it consciously, it becomes our ally. He later wrote that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. That was the essence of his madness, radical acceptance of everything within. Modern psychology often treats madness as malfunction. Jung treated it as a message. He believed that what we call psychosis might sometimes be a spiritual emergency, a breakdown of the old psychic structure before renewal. The danger lies not in the visions themselves, but in being swallowed by them without awareness. Jung's genius was his capacity to remain both participant and observer, to enter the storm and still take notes. His descent revealed to him the archetypal structure of the psyche. He recognized patterns that would form the foundation of his later theories: the shadow, the anima, the self. These were not inventions, they were discoveries born from direct experience. He saw that humanity's myths and religions are symbolic expressions of the same psychic realities he was living. The gods of old had not died, they had moved into the human unconscious. This insight reshaped psychology. Jung realized that personal neuroses are rooted in collective patterns. When an individual suffers, it is often because they are trapped in an archetypal drama without knowing it. His own madness made him the mapmaker of this inner territory. The Red Book became his chart of the invisible world, a record of how the human mind disintegrates and reintegrates. Jung's descent also redefined the meaning of spirituality. He rejected both the dogmatic religion that denies psychology and the sterile science that denies spirit. For him, the divine was not external, it was the numinous energy within the psyche. The divine madness he endured was the psyche's way of reconnecting him with the sacred dimension of existence. Through his suffering, Jung rediscovered God not as a distant deity, but as a living presence inside the human soul. He realized that the greatest danger of the modern age is spiritual emptiness. When reason dominates, the soul rebels. Depression, anxiety, and moral confusion become the symptoms of a collective neurosis. Jung saw this not only in his patients, but in the world itself. He wrote that modern man has lost all faith in himself and in the meaning of his life. The cure, he believed, is not found in returning to old dogmas, but in experiencing the divine personally within. Thus, the descent into the unconscious is not an escape from reality, it is a return to it. To encounter the unconscious is to encounter the truth of human nature, its contradictions, its depth, its hunger for meaning. Jung's Red Book shows that only by descending into our own darkness can we recover the lost light. Every soul at some point must face its own Red Book. It may not be written in ink, but in dreams, heartbreak, and silence. The process feels like falling apart, but it is the psyche's way of calling us home. Jung teaches that the divine is hidden precisely where we are most afraid to look, inside the chaos, inside the madness, inside ourselves. His descent reminds us that true sanity is not the absence of madness, but the ability to hold it consciously, to make meaning of it. Divine madness, therefore, is not insanity. It is the soul's rebellion against a life too small for its truth. And in that rebellion lies our salvation. Part 2. Conversations with the soul, meeting Philemon and the inner figures. When Jung entered the landscapes of his inner world, he was not a tourist of dreams. He was a pilgrim of the soul. What awaited him there were not abstractions, but presences, living intelligences within the psyche that seemed to know more about him than he knew about himself. In the Red Book, these presences took form and voice: Philemon, Elijah, Salome, the serpent, and countless other figures who emerged from the unconscious to speak in their own language. They were not symbols he created. They were beings he encountered. To Jung, they were autonomous aspects of the psyche, fragments of the self clothed in mythic form. It was through these conversations that Jung discovered one of the most radical truths of analytical psychology: that the soul is not silent. Beneath the ego's chatter, there exists a deeper dialogue unfolding between consciousness and the unconscious. The figures in the Red Book were the emissaries of this hidden realm. They confronted Jung, instructed him, and sometimes terrified him. Yet he listened not with the skepticism of a scientist, but with the reverence of a mystic who knows that truth can wear strange masks. Philemon, the most famous of these figures, became Jung's inner teacher. He was the embodiment of wisdom that transcends human logic, the archetype of the wise old man. Jung described him as an old man with the wings of a kingfisher, a being of immense authority and serenity. Philemon was not merely an image, he was a relationship. He corrected Jung's arrogance, taught him humility before the unconscious, and guided him toward understanding the symbolic language of the psyche. Philemon represented superior insight, Jung later wrote. He was a figure of a kind of spiritual authority, which was in no way inferior to that of Christ. The appearance of Philemon marked a turning point in Jung's inner work. Until then, Jung had viewed his visions with caution, analyzing them as psychological phenomena. But Philemon spoke with such coherence, such otherworldly clarity, that Jung began to realize he was dealing with something beyond his personal mind. He wrote, "Philemon taught me psychic objectivity, the reality of the psyche." What Jung meant is that the inner world has its own laws and beings, as real in their dimension as trees and mountains are in ours. This insight shattered the modern illusion that imagination is unreal. The soul, Jung discovered, imagines as nature grows. It is a process of creation. In the Red Book, dialogues between Jung and these figures often unfold like sacred dramas. He asks questions, they respond with paradoxes. They challenge his morality, his intellect, his faith. Through Philemon, Jung learned that the intellect alone cannot save the soul. Knowledge without experience becomes sterile. Faith without self-knowledge becomes fanaticism. The true task of the individual is to reconcile opposites, to bridge the conscious and unconscious, spirit and instinct, reason and madness. Philemon's voice was the synthesis of all these tensions, the sound of the psyche seeking wholeness. But Jung's encounters were not limited to Philemon. He also met Elijah and Salome, figures drawn from the Judeo-Christian imagination, yet reanimated in the theater of his own mind. Elijah appeared as a prophet of ancient wisdom, while Salome embodied erotic and emotional intensity. Together they represented the union of masculine and feminine forces within Jung's psyche, the logos and the eros, the spiritual and the instinctual. In these visions, Jung was not reading myths, he was living them. His psyche had become a living mythological field where every inner event carried archetypal significance. Salome in particular forced Jung to confront his own repressed emotional nature. She appeared blind at first, unable to see, symbolizing the unconscious eros that must be redeemed through awareness. Jung resisted her presence, for she stirred feelings that threatened his spiritual pride. Yet through dialogue with her, he discovered that the feminine soul, what he later called the anima, is the gateway to transformation. Without embracing the feminine within, no man can reach the self. The anima is both guide and temptation, muse and destroyer. In Salome, Jung faced his desire, his vulnerability, and his longing for wholeness. Elijah, on the other hand, embodied the principle of logos, divine reason, guidance, and moral structure. He instructed Jung to accept his fate as a seer, not a scientist. Jung resisted the title, yet he understood the message that psychological knowledge, divorced from spiritual truth, becomes lifeless. Elijah's presence reminded him that wisdom must be lived, not theorized. Together, Elijah and Salome enacted within Jung the eternal dance of opposites that defines the psyche's growth. Their dialogue culminated in the inner realization that the divine is not found outside, but in the reconciliation of inner contradictions. Philemon, Elijah, and Salome were not figments of imagination in the ordinary sense. Jung understood them as manifestations of archetypes, universal patterns of meaning that dwell in the collective unconscious. These archetypes use images, symbols, and stories to communicate with consciousness. In ancient cultures, they were called gods and spirits. In modern psychology, they appear as complexes, dreams, and fantasies. Jung's genius was to recognize that both interpretations describe the same reality through different languages. To the ancients, the gods were real. To Jung, they are psychologically real living energies of the psyche. Jung's dialogues with his inner figures revealed that the human soul is not a monologue, but a polyphony. Within each of us are countless voices, child and sage, lover and warrior, saint and shadow. Mental suffering often arises when one voice dominates or represses the others. The path of individuation, Jung realized, requires listening to all of them. By conversing with his inner figures, Jung was giving space for each aspect of his soul to speak. This was not mere introspection, it was communion. He called this process active imagination, but its essence is spiritual. One enters a meditative state, allowing images to emerge spontaneously, then engages them consciously through dialogue, drawing, or writing. It is the middle way between fantasy and analysis, a bridge between the conscious and unconscious. For Jung, active imagination was both therapy and revelation. It taught him that the soul seeks relationship with the ego, with the world, and with the divine. When we ignore it, it manifests as symptoms. When we listen, it becomes guidance. Through these conversations, Jung experienced the psyche as a vast ecosystem. Each figure represented an organ of the soul, a necessary part of psychic life. Philemon was wisdom, Salome was passion, Elijah was moral authority, the serpent was instinct. To reject any of them would be to reject part of himself. Integration required dialogue, not domination. Jung understood that the goal of the soul is not perfection, but wholeness. Wholeness includes the broken, the dark, the irrational. Only by accepting these aspects can one approach what Jung called the self, the totality of the psyche. Philemon often warned Jung against inflation, the danger of mistaking psychic experience for personal greatness. The more Jung entered the imaginal world, the more he risked losing his grounding in ordinary reality. Philemon reminded him that humility is the guardian of wisdom. Men forget that the gods are within them, Philemon said, and thus they become possessed. Jung grasped that to be possessed by an archetype is to live unconsciously under its power. True individuation requires conscious participation with these forces without being consumed by them. The dialogues in the Red Book, also reveal the moral dimension of inner work. The unconscious is not merely a source of inspiration, it also contains what Jung called the shadow, the denied and rejected aspects of the personality. Jung's figures often forced him to confront his own pride, cruelty, and fear. Philemon's teachings were never comfortable. He dismantled Jung's illusions, exposed his ego, and demanded sincerity. The path to the self passes through confession, not perfection. In facing his inner figures honestly, Jung was performing a kind of sacred psychotherapy, one that precedes all modern technique. What makes Jung's experience extraordinary is not that he saw visions, but that he recorded them with scientific precision and spiritual reverence. He painted the images, wrote down every conversation, and later analyzed them symbolically. The Red Book is the marriage of mysticism and psychology, art and science, soul and intellect. Jung showed that one can explore the depths without losing the capacity for reason. The key is conscious relationship, the dialogue between the observer and the observed. These encounters with inner figures were not unique to Jung, they are universal. Mystics, shamans, prophets, and artists across cultures have reported similar experiences. What Jung offered was a psychological framework that made such experiences accessible to modern people. He showed that we do not need to externalize our gods, they live within. The task of consciousness is to engage them creatively rather than repress them. To speak with one's inner figures is to recover the lost art of inner dialogue that the modern world has forgotten. Each figure Jung met reflected a fragment of his own soul, but also a universal archetype. Philemon is the eternal sage, Elijah the prophetic voice of conscience, Salome the embodiment of Eros, the serpent the energy of instinct and transformation. When integrated, they form a symbolic mandala, a representation of psychic totality. Jung's personal mythology thus becomes a map for the collective. Every person must eventually meet their own Philemon, their own Salome, their own serpent. The language may differ, but the pattern is the same. In Jung's later reflections, he often emphasized that Philemon was not a substitute for external religion. Rather, he was the mediator between the individual soul and the divine. Philemon taught that God is not an object but a relationship, a dynamic process unfolding within the psyche. This insight foreshadowed Jung's later concept of the self as the imago Dei, the image of God within the human. To converse with Philemon was in a sense to converse with God in the language of the soul. Jung also recognized the danger inherent in such dialogues. The boundary between imagination and delusion is fragile. Without self-awareness, one can mistake inner figures for literal beings and lose orientation. Jung maintained his sanity through disciplined reflection, art, and writing. The very act of recording his visions anchored them in the material world. This integration of spirit and matter, image and word, is the essence of his method. It transforms the unconscious into consciousness, chaos into meaning. Through his conversations, Jung learned that the soul is not a passive entity, but an active counterpart to consciousness. It possesses its own desires, fears, and intelligence. When ignored, it rebels. When honored, it becomes an ally. Philemon's teachings revealed that the ultimate purpose of human life is dialogue between man and God, ego and soul, light and shadow. Silence is not the absence of the divine, but its language. In listening inwardly, one begins to hear the eternal conversation that has been happening all along. Jung's meetings with Philemon marked the beginning of his lifelong devotion to what he called psychic reality. He no longer sought truth solely in external observation, but in inner revelation. He saw that the psyche produces myth because it is mythic by nature. The soul speaks through symbols because symbols unite opposites. They bridge the finite and the infinite. To engage with these symbols consciously is to participate in the divine process of creation. Each image, each figure is a fragment of the world's soul reflecting itself through us. Philemon's final teaching to Jung was that wisdom is not found in knowledge but in relationship. To relate consciously to the inner world is the highest form of intelligence. It demands humility, patience, and courage. the courage to face voices that contradict one's ego. In this sense, the conversations in the Red Book are mirrors for every seeker. They remind us that healing is not achieved by silencing the voices within, but by listening until they become one harmonious choir. The dialogue with the soul is the true therapy of the modern age. It asks us to step beyond the noise of opinion and ideology into the sacred silence where our own Philemon waits. There, within the stillness, the unconscious begins to speak, not as madness, but as guidance. Jung's example teaches that the soul is not an illusion to be cured, but a partner to be loved. The task is not to escape from these inner figures, but to learn from them, for they are the emissaries of our wholeness. In the end, Jung's conversations were never about discovering something new, but about remembering what humanity has always known, that the divine speaks through the human heart, that the unseen is more real than the visible, and that wisdom begins when we dare to listen. The voices of Philemon, Elijah, and Salome are not ghosts from Jung's past. They are archetypes that still whisper in the dreams of every soul longing to awaken. Part 3. The symbolic language of the soul, the alchemy of inner transformation. The soul does not speak in words, it speaks in symbols. This realization became the cornerstone of Jung's entire psychology. During the years of the Red Book, Jung learned that when reason breaks, when intellect fails, the psyche turns to imagery to express truths too vast for logic. Symbols arise from the depths like messengers from another world, carrying meaning that cannot be captured by literal thought. They are bridges between the conscious and the unconscious, between the human and the divine. Jung discovered that every dream, every vision, every spontaneous image that appeared before his inner eye contained a message encoded in symbolic form. The unconscious communicates not by direct statement, but through transformation, through metaphor, through paradox. It is an artist, not a lecturer. To understand it, one must learn its language, the symbolic language of the soul. In the Red Book, this language unfolded before him in waves of images, serpents and suns, blood and fire trees that spoke gods who wept. He did not interpret these as hallucinations, but as revelations of psychic truth. The symbol for Jung is not an allegory. An allegory explains itself. A symbol does not. A symbol is alive precisely because it cannot be exhausted by interpretation. It points beyond itself to something infinite. The moment you define it completely, you kill it. This is why Jung insisted that symbols are expressions of something unknown, seeds of meaning that continue to unfold as consciousness evolves. The symbol is not a decoration of thought. It is the birth of thought itself. As Jung delved deeper into his inner visions, he began to see the psyche as an alchemical vessel. The images that rose from his unconscious were the raw materials of transformation, prima materia, the chaotic substance from which spiritual gold is refined. The ancient alchemists, misunderstood as primitive chemists, were in fact projecting their inner processes onto matter. Jung recognized in their obscure formulas a mirror of the psychological process he himself was living. The alchemical transformation was a metaphor for individuation, the gradual union of opposites within the psyche. In the alchemical imagination, lead becomes gold through fire. In the psychic realm, suffering becomes consciousness through meaning. Jung's descent into the unconscious was the nigredo, the blackening stage of alchemy, where all certainty dissolves. The ego dies in darkness, so that a new form of being may emerge. The visions and dialogues recorded in the Red Book were the flames of this inner furnace. Each image, each symbol was a step in the soul's purification. One of the most profound discoveries Jung made during this time was that the psyche itself strives toward wholeness. It is not chaotic. It is teleological. It moves with purpose. The unconscious produces symbols not to confuse us, but to guide us. Each symbol is a hint, a fragment of a greater pattern the conscious mind has not yet grasped. When we learn to interpret them not with intellect, but with intuition, we participate in what Jung called the transcendent function, the process by which new meaning emerges from the union of opposites. For Jung, the Red Book became the laboratory of this alchemy. He observed how inner images would transform when he engaged them consciously. A frightening figure might soften into a teacher. A demonic presence might reveal itself as a guardian. He realized that consciousness acts like heat upon the material of the unconscious. It changes its form. When we meet our shadows with awareness, they begin to transmute into energy, into creativity, into life. The task is not to repress the dark, but to illuminate it. Light does not destroy darkness, it reveals its nature. The symbolic language of the soul operates beyond moral dualism. To the unconscious, good and evil are not absolutes but complementary forces. Jung wrote that the unconscious is neutral, it contains everything. In his visions, angels and demons often appeared side by side. He understood that both are necessary aspects of the total psyche. The divine light cannot exist without the shadow that gives it contrast. The alchemical work, therefore, is not about purification through exclusion, but through integration. To become whole is to hold both serpent and dove within the same heart. Jung's art during this period reflected this truth vividly. The mandalas he painted, circular radiant symbols filled with intricate geometry, were not aesthetic experiments but psychic revelations. They appeared spontaneously, often after a period of intense chaos, as if the unconscious were expressing its innate tendency toward order. The mandala, a symbol found in nearly every spiritual tradition, represents the self, the center and totality of the psyche. When Jung saw these forms arising from within him, he realized that they were messages of healing, the soul's way of restoring balance after disintegration. He came to understand that symbols are alive only when experienced, not when dissected. They cannot be forced into rational frameworks without losing their vitality. This is why modern people, surrounded by dead symbols, feel spiritually starved. Religion has turned its living myths into doctrines. Science has stripped the world of mystery. Jung's work in the Red Book was a revolt against this death of imagination. He sought to revive the sacred function of the symbol, to make contact again with the living reality of the psyche. The alchemy of inner transformation, as Jung experienced it, begins in chaos and ends in coherence. But the process is never linear. It is circular spiral alive. One must descend again and again into the depths, facing new aspects of the unconscious each time. The transformation is not achieved by willpower, but by surrender. The ego must learn to serve the self, just as the alchemist served the mysterious forces of nature. The psyche transforms itself through relationship between conscious and unconscious, masculine and feminine, light and dark. The alchemist spoke of the conjunctio, the sacred marriage of opposites. Jung recognized this as the central mystery of psychological transformation. In his visions, he often encountered symbolic unions, fire and water, man and woman, sun and moon. These were not romantic fantasies, but representations of the soul's striving toward totality. The psyche longs to reconcile all that it has divided. Individuation, therefore, is not self-improvement, it is self-union. The Red Book shows this process unfolding in vivid imagery. Jung's ego is repeatedly humbled, torn apart, reborn. He meets figures who embody everything he rejects, and through dialogue he learns to embrace them. This is the true alchemy, not turning metal into gold, but turning fear into awareness, judgment into compassion, fragmentation into wholeness. The fire that accomplishes this is consciousness itself, the capacity to endure contradiction without fleeing to one side. Jung saw that symbols are not mere decorations of the mind, they are organs of psychic growth. Just as the body breathes air, the soul breathes symbols. Without them, it suffocates. This is why modern life, stripped of symbolic imagination, produces such anxiety and emptiness. The psyche craves meaning the way lungs crave oxygen. When deprived of it, it generates neurosis as a compensatory symptom. Dreams, art, and visions are the soul's attempts to restore meaning through symbolic communication. The alchemical imagery that pervades the Red Book, the serpent, the sun, the chalice, the dragon, reflects stages of psychic transformation. Each symbol arises when the psyche needs to express a shift in consciousness. The serpent represents instinctive life, cyclical renewal, and the energy of the unconscious itself. The sun symbolizes illumination, awareness, and the divine center. The chalice, the container of transformation, represents the capacity of consciousness to hold opposites. Jung learned that to understand these symbols intellectually is not enough. One must experience their energy inwardly. The symbol is a door, not a definition. As Jung continued to paint and write, he noticed that certain images reappeared across time, linking his personal experience to the collective heritage of humanity. He began to understand the psyche as a living archive of universal symbols, the collective unconscious. Myths, religions, and fairy tales are expressions of the same deep structures he was witnessing firsthand. The gods of antiquity were not dead. They had become psychological. Every human being still enacts the dramas of Prometheus, Christ, Isis, and the serpent in their dreams and crises. To ignore these patterns is to live unconsciously under their sway. To recognize them is to participate in the eternal process of creation. The symbolic language of the soul, therefore, is both personal and collective. It arises from individual experience, but speaks with universal resonance. This is why the Red Book feels both intimate and mythic. Jung's descent is his own, yet it echoes the timeless archetypal journey of transformation that myth has always described. The images that filled his pages are not merely his, they are ours. They belong to the eternal drama of human becoming. Jung often emphasized that the alchemical process is not about moral perfection but psychological wholeness. To integrate the shadow is to recognize that evil, suffering, and desire are not to be eradicated but understood. The alchemist does not flee from the darkness, he uses it as fuel for illumination. In the same way, the soul grows not by avoiding pain but by transforming it into meaning. Every trauma, every loss, every fear carries symbolic content waiting to be redeemed. The question is not, how do I escape this, but what is the meaning seeking to emerge through this? Through his work in the Red Book, Jung also realized that transformation demands imagination. The rational mind can analyze, but only imagination can integrate. Imagination bridges the unseen and the seen. It allows us to participate in the unfolding of the unconscious. When we engage with inner images creatively through art, writing, meditation, we become co-creators in our own evolution. Jung called this the living symbol, an image that transforms us as we engage with it. The alchemist's fire burns in the act of imagination. He also learned that symbolic experience heals because it restores connection to the sacred. In modern times, people suffer not only from trauma but from meaninglessness. The absence of symbol leaves them spiritually orphaned. The soul longs for a myth to inhabit a story that gives coherence to its struggles. Jung's alchemical psychology provides that myth, the myth of transformation where the human being is both the crucible and the gold. In this myth, suffering becomes initiation and madness becomes the raw material of revelation. The alchemy of inner transformation is never purely individual. Jung saw that when one person integrates their shadow, it affects the collective psyche. Every act of consciousness contributes to the healing of the world. The ancient alchemists said, "As above, so below, as within, so without." Jung extended this axiom into psychology. Inner transformation mirrors outer transformation. When we redeem our own darkness, we redeem a fragment of humanity's darkness. The personal is always cosmic. The symbolic process also led Jung to reimagine God. He no longer conceived of the divine as an external authority, but as a dynamic process within the psyche. The symbols of God, light, fire, the sun, the mandala, are expressions of the self, the totality striving for realization. To experience these symbols consciously is to participate in divinity. In this sense, Jung's psychology is a modern continuation of alchemy's secret goal, the realization of the divine within matter. The Red Book stands as a record of this sacred alchemy. Its pages are painted in blood red, as if to signify the price of transformation. Jung's encounters with death, madness, and revelation were not metaphors. They were lived experiences of psychic death and rebirth. Through symbolic engagement, he emerged renewed. He learned that transformation is not the elimination of opposites, but their reconciliation in a higher unity. The self, the divine center, is born from the tension of contradictions held consciously. To speak the language of the soul is to recognize that every image, every emotion, every fragment of experience has meaning. Nothing is meaningless in the psyche. Even despair carries the seed of new life. The alchemist knew that the blackest matter conceals the brightest light. Jung knew the same of the human heart. When the ego surrenders to the symbolic process, the soul begins to speak, and healing follows naturally. In the end, the alchemy of inner transformation is not a theory, it is an art, a devotion, a way of being. It requires patience with mystery, faith in symbols, and the courage to descend into darkness again and again. The soul, through its symbolic language, is always at work, shaping us, refining us, leading us toward wholeness. To live consciously in that process is to live the work of the Red Book, the eternal alchemy of becoming fully human, and through that divine. Part 4. The birth of the self-madness as the door to divinity madness is the oldest sacrament. Long before the temples and cathedrals, before philosophy and dogma, there was the trembling of the human soul in the presence of the divine. Madness was the sign that the gods had entered a person, that consciousness was being torn open to receive revelation. In the Red Book, Jung discovered that this ancient pattern still lives within us. His descent into apparent insanity was in truth an initiation. It was through madness that the divine sought to be born in him, and through him in modern humanity. Jung came to see that the psyche has its own sacred rhythm, a cycle of death and rebirth that mirrors the mystery of Christ's passion. When the old structures of consciousness collapse, when reason disintegrates and certainty vanishes, something greater stirs beneath the ruins. This greater is what Jung called the self, the totality of the psyche, both human and divine. The ego experiences this emergence as catastrophe because it feels itself dying, but the self experiences it as fulfillment because it is the long-awaited union of the soul with God. He wrote in the Red Book that he had to allow God to happen within him. That phrase, "allow God," reveals the essence of divine madness. It is not the conquest of the spirit by human will, it is surrender. It is the realization that the divine does not live in heaven but in the heart that dares to break. To be overtaken by madness is to be overtaken by the infinite. It is to stand where boundaries dissolve, between reason and revelation, between self and self, between man and God. During those nights of visions, Jung felt himself possessed by forces that transcended comprehension. He saw gods of fire, serpents of light, cosmic trees whose roots reached into death. He conversed with prophets and demons. Yet he understood that these were not hallucinations but revelations of the living God within the psyche. The divine, he realized, is not a static being but a dynamic process, one that unfolds through the human soul. The self is the image of God in us, and madness is the birth pang of that image seeking form. To modern man this sounds heretical. We have been taught that God is wholly other, that madness is a defect, that salvation comes through reason and control. But Jung saw that the psyche does not obey such divisions. The divine cannot be contained by doctrine, it erupts through experience. It shatters our moral and intellectual order so that a higher order can emerge. Madness in this sacred sense is not the absence of reason, it is the presence of a deeper reason, one that speaks in symbols, paradoxes, and dreams. When Jung wrote the Red Book, he felt as though he were both the patient and the priest of his own transformation. The process was not a clinical cure, but a spiritual rebirth. He entered the dark womb of the unconscious and found there a God who was both terrible and beautiful, a God who demanded his total participation. The divine does not ask to be believed, it asks to be lived. Jung's madness was the crucible through which the finite met the infinite, the mortal met the eternal. He often said that the experience of God is always a wound. The encounter with the numinous overwhelms the ego, exposing its limitations. That wound, however, is also the opening through which grace enters. The suffering that accompanies divine madness is the price of transformation. It is the fire of purification, the nigredo of the alchemist, the dark night of the mystic. Only by passing through it can one be born anew. In his visions, Jung saw himself descending into an underworld filled with flames and serpents, only to emerge carrying a glowing stone, a symbol of the eternal self. The stone, like the philosopher's stone of alchemy, represented the union of spirit and matter, the embodiment of divinity in human form. The self is not an abstraction, it is incarnate. It is the divine made flesh in the individual soul. For Jung, this realization transformed everything he thought he knew about God. The divine was no longer an external father or a cosmic lawgiver. It was the living mystery within creation. The self is God's way of becoming conscious in humanity. When we suffer, when we are torn apart by contradiction, the divine is experiencing itself through us. In this sense, human life is the theater of God's awakening. Madness becomes holy when we recognize it as part of that awakening. The prophets of old, Isaiah, Ezekiel, John of Patmos, spoke in the language of madness because they had seen what ordinary eyes cannot see. Their visions were terrifying precisely because they were real. Jung realized that the Red Book placed him in their lineage. He was not a scientist dissecting the soul. He was a vessel through which the eternal was speaking. Yet his genius was to interpret this not as theology but as psychology. The divine drama he taught plays itself out in every human psyche. Each person is called to live their own revelation, their own crucifixion and resurrection. The process by which the self is born is both violent and sacred. The ego resists with all its strength. It clings to its definitions, its certainties, its morality. But the self demands totality. It brings forth images that contradict everything we believe about ourselves. It forces us to confront our shadow, to integrate what we have denied. This integration is not merely psychological, it is spiritual. To accept the shadow is to recognize that God includes darkness. The divine is not pure light, but the union of light and dark, life and death, creation and destruction. In one of his visions, Jung encountered the figure of Christ bleeding into the roots of a great tree. He understood that this image was not about the historical Jesus, but about the eternal pattern of sacrifice, the death of the old self for the birth of the new. The crucifixion is not a one-time event, but a universal process that repeats within every soul. When the ego dies to its pride, its control, its separation, it becomes the vessel through which divine consciousness flows. The self is the risen Christ within us, the God who awakens through human suffering. Jung often wrote that God needs man to become conscious. It is a staggering idea that the infinite depends on the finite for self-realization. Yet this paradox lies at the heart of divine madness. The ego must surrender but not annihilate itself. It must participate in God's unfolding. The relationship between man and God is reciprocal. Just as we seek God, God seeks us. The self is the meeting point, the alchemical marriage, where the human and the divine recognize themselves as one. This realization does not come through theology but through ordeal. The ego must be broken open. It must experience the chaos of not knowing who it is, where it stands, or what is real. Only in that void does the deeper reality emerge. Madness in this context is not an error, it is initiation. It is the sacred wound through which the soul gives birth to divinity. The ancients called it divine frenzy, the madness of Dionysus, the inspiration of prophets, the ecstasy of saints. Jung lived it in the silence of his study, where reason fell away and the voice of eternity spoke. He wrote that his task was to translate the emotions of the gods into the language of reason. This was the birth of analytical psychology, an attempt to render divine experience intelligible without diminishing its mystery. The gods had become psychological, but no less real. Jung's madness was not the end of sanity, but the expansion of it. He demonstrated that true sanity includes the irrational, just as true divinity includes humanity. The birth of the self is not the triumph of light over darkness, but their union. It is the realization that heaven and hell are not places but states of consciousness. Within each soul lies the potential for both, and the path to wholeness passes through both. The self is born when these opposites are reconciled in awareness, when we can hold suffering and joy, love and anger, faith and doubt without fleeing from either. This capacity to contain paradox is what makes consciousness divine. In the Red Book, Jung often depicts himself as a traveler guided by Philemon through landscapes of fire, water, and stars. Each element represents a stage of transformation. Fire purifies, water renews, air enlightens, earth stabilizes. The journey culminates in the vision of the mandala, the symbol of totality. In that moment, Jung experiences himself not as an individual, but as part of the cosmic order. The mandala is the face of God seen from within the self fully realized. To experience such unity is overwhelming. The ego trembles before the magnitude of it. This trembling is what we call madness. But when held consciously, it becomes ecstasy. Madness and ecstasy are two sides of the same coin. The difference lies in awareness. Unconscious madness destroys, conscious madness redeems. Jung's gift was his ability to remain aware while traversing the depths. He became both participant and witness, priest and patient. Through him, divine madness became a science of the soul. The divine seeks incarnation through the human. The self is not content to remain an abstract ideal. It wants to live, to breathe, to love, to suffer. Each person is a vessel of that incarnation. When the divine awakens within, it demands everything. It dismantles falsehood, strips away illusions, and asks the ultimate question, will you allow me to be born in you? Most resist, for the price is too high. But those who accept become transformed. They become, as Jung wrote, a symbol of the living God. Madness, then, is the threshold of divinity, the fiery gate through which the soul must pass. It is the place where identity dissolves so that being can emerge. The ego fears it because it cannot control it. Yet beyond that fear lies grace. The divine does not destroy what is human, it completes it. The birth of the self is the fulfillment of humanity, not its negation. It is the realization that we are not separate from God, but expressions of God's own unfolding consciousness. In this revelation, morality transforms. Good and evil lose their absolute separation. They become polarities of one divine energy. This is not moral relativism, but transcendence. To see with the eyes of the self is to see creation as whole, to recognize that every act of destruction carries the seed of renewal, that every fall conceals redemption. Jung's divine madness taught him that sin is not final, that even darkness serves the light. The divine does not judge, it transforms. The self once born radiates a quiet power. It is no longer driven by fear or ambition, but by participation in a larger purpose. Jung described it as a center that holds. The one who has endured divine madness becomes a vessel of peace, not because he has escaped suffering, but because he has embraced it. His sanity is spacious enough to contain contradiction. He becomes transparent to the divine, a living mandala, through which the light of consciousness flows into the world. This is why Jung said that the Red Book was the most important work of his life, though it was never meant for publication during his lifetime. It was too sacred, too intimate. It was his gospel of the soul, the record of how madness became revelation, how psychology became theology, how man became the womb of God. Through his journey, he restored the bridge between the human and the divine that modernity had broken. In the silence of his visions, Jung heard the voice that every soul longs to hear. You are not alone. The divine is within you, waiting to be born. That is the ultimate message of his madness, that insanity, when endured with consciousness, becomes a path to God. The self is not found by avoiding suffering, but by sanctifying it. The divine is born where we least expect it, in the wound, in the loss, in the madness that breaks the heart open to eternity. Madness is not always the end, it is often the beginning. Jung's journey through the Red Book teaches us that when life collapses, when reason fails, something eternal begins to speak. The voice of the divine is not heard in calm minds, but in broken hearts. So the next time you feel lost, remember you are not falling apart, you are being reborn.